Snek, you are a Mossad agent. That's what the chat says, so he's getting obviously, yes.
You can't just be a single agent. You need to be at least double or triple.
Right.
So I'm also French and Russian.
Oh, well, you're trying to top me then, because I'm CIA, KGB, and Mossad all at once, even though there's no KGB.
Yeah, time traveling KGB still.
Yes. So basically, anyone who goes against the Roman Catholic Church, in the mind of the trad, you're in the KGB. That makes a lot of sense. But what happens when the papacy supports communism? Is that communist? I mean, you had a good meme the other day talking about Francis. I mean, isn't Francis more communist than we are? But we're the KGB? I mean, what's the logic of this?
You can see what is called liberation theology. And in FRATELLI TUTTI, you can see liberation theology not simply being this South American stuff, but really coming back to Rome, just like Pachamama. Pachamama has existed for a while in Southern America, and now it's just back into Rome, thanks to Francis. So these are stuff that existed in commune with Rome for a while. This is just the expression of it, the manifestation of it.
Right. Now, a quick rundown. So, liberation theology is the idea that the gospel and its message is a social message, and they attempted, mainly Protestant theologians, liberal theologians, by the support of the Rockefellers, as is covered in their authorized biography, to demythologize, to remove the miraculous elements, the idea of atonement for sin and this kind of stuff through Christ's death, to make it more of just a social gospel. That is what liberation theology is about. It's about the message of the gospel being an oppressed group needing to uprise against their oppressors. And so it's not, it's turning it into a class warfare thing rather than a theological, metaphysical, ethical system, which is what, traditional Christianity is. It's turning it into something that is a tool of modern, political movements. And so a lot of different groups have tried to do this with Christianity. And you could say that Orthodoxy, and for even many years, perhaps the West, was opposed to this idea, but it's really in the 20th century that you really begin to see the caving to this idea. And I would argue that really, even prior to Vatican I, you can go back to the Renaissance if you wanted to find that humanism. But in the documents of Vatican II, you really have, I think, the dogmatic capitulation to this idea that ultimately it's a social gospel. What do you think?
I mean, that's exactly what was criticized since the beginning. When Saint Gregory Palamas was starting to see these ideas that would actually lead to the Renaissance, he said that you are on the way to atheism because of your theological choices. This is going to lead to humanism. This is going to lead to the removal of the action of God in the world. And his prediction was pretty impressive, because that's exactly what happened. And again, we can go back to Saint Gregory, the theologian, Saint Gregory of Nazianzus, who said that the theological choices we made are influencing our politics directly. Why? Because politics is the application of a philosophy, and philosophy cannot exist without a metaphysical framework, which is presuppositional to an extent. So if your theology doesn't match, your philosophy won't match, and your politics won't match. And that's why the introduction of humanism is after that you have a decline in the political systems that you can see in the world.
A little bit of background to the presuppositions in Francis's argumentation. If we go to Gaudium et Spes, which is the famous Vatican II document about the church in the modern world, you get these arguments from John the 23rd, his famous encyclical at the beginning, about the church and about Pachamama, about the idea of a global social control. And it begins with, by the time you get to chapter 4, they want to discuss the fact that, well, because of natural law in the Roman Catholic conception, and because of the misinterpretation of the way Jesus operated with the state. So they're going to say, they make the argument that Christ did not give the church any mission in the political, economic, or social sphere. Now, wait a minute. The church here says, the Vatican II church, that Christ doesn't have anything to do with politics, economics, social sphere. The church is supposed to be a religious institution. Okay, but now we're being told that the mission of the church is to reform the social sphere to make it essentially secular. You have the rejection of the idea of confessional states, clearly, in Vatican II. And the argumentation for this is natural law, right? So in the Roman Catholic Thomistic scheme. So in chapter 2, proper development of culture, it says that man is has the ability through autonomy to achieve full humanness. He can be fully human as a autonomous being through culture. Now, what exactly that means, I don't know, but they go on to say in section 55 that humanity, quote unquote, is the autonomous author of culture. So in the new humanism, as it's called, that they're recognizing and trying to deal with, they're saying that, well, we've got to replace humanism with a better humanism. But the response that is being given to atheistic secular humanism is not to call it out and to oppose it, but to try to find some synthesis with it. And so they're admitting that, yes, man is just man is not an autonomous creator of culture. Culture is just as much under theocracy, as anything else in society. And they even go on to say, predating what John Paul and Francis have said about the death penalty, they hint at it's time to totally outlaw war, right? And they say that an international body could perhaps be erected for a one world government that could then enforce this banning of war. Now you can see the logic of Francis saying, basically, let's not have, notions of self-defense. He says that this document goes on to say that the church herself needs a change of heart about the global cultural relationship between church and society. In fact, a universal global government or socialistic state, perhaps, right? This is sections of Gaudium et Spes. This is sections 80, 81, 82, 83, 84, that the path to one world government will be achieved. This is what it's saying, through total global disarmament. It then goes on to say that that parents ultimately ought to have a right to determine the number of their children, which is an interesting reversal of previous statements. Now, they're going to not be, that's fuzzy. They're going to turn around and say, yeah, but that doesn't mean you can, it says it can be left to the judgment of the parents. Okay, so that is section 87 of Gaudium et Spes. And then the only reason I'm talking about Gaudium et Spes is that the intention of the council, it says, is to promote universal brotherhood and the dignity of man, right? So that's the essence of Gaudium et Spes, this ridiculous doctrine. It's based on the type of argumentation that you find in John Courtney Murray. He was instrumental in getting this document accepted at Vatican II. It's based on his Jesuit arguments for natural law providing the means by which the church can have nothing to do with the social order. That's where it leads, right? And that's where we are. So Francis, I'm trying to stress here, is not telling you some, whoa, dude, this is crazy. It's revolutionary. He's just repeating the principles laid down in Gaudium et Spes.
Even though when you ask
well, actually, this is, I would argue that Vatican II is. You do have to accept Vatican II. Even if it's not ex cathedra, it's still ordinary universal magisterium. It's binding on the entire Vatican II church and apparatus for 60 plus years. The Vatican II documents and John Courtney Murray are telling you that the church, in their new conception, should not have any influence or thing to say to the secular state. Okay, so if we went with that, and we should have the, desacralization of the civil sphere, of the social sphere. If we should have then purely secular states, then why are they turning around and saying, oh, but we do need to set up international bodies to police the world, and the Pope can tell you what you should do in your nation states morally? You see you see the contradiction here? It went from the church has nothing to say to the state to now you're going to have to submit to a global government. What? You see what I'm saying?
You had the previous position that was saying that the church has two swords, and one of them is to be wielded by the state for the church. So that's even a reversal.
The purpose of ecumenism is to bring the lost brethren back into the fold. But remember, the body of the mystical body of Christ, which is a visible institution, can't fail and can't split. So you can't have two conceptions of the church at the same time that are contradictory. On the one hand, a visible institution that has never failed, that has never defected, it's indefectible, based on the Roman See and Vatican I. And at the same time, turn around and say, there is a aspect to which this visible church has been insufficient, has failed in a grand scope, such that the Orthodox constitute one lung of the church that are somehow still in the church but divided from the church on the basis of not accepting the papacy. It doesn't work like that. The Roman Catholic dogma prior to Vatican II was the either or in-out view, right? Now, they were not really consistent with it, but what I'm saying is that if you look at Satis Cognitum or Mystici Corporis or the Latae Sententiae canon law statements about excommunication, the dogma is that if you persist in heresy, you remove yourself ipso facto from the body. And this applies to all heretics. All heretics and schismatics are removed from the body. So there's no such thing as the concentric circles of communion with Rome and with the Catholic Church. That's what I'm trying to say here, is that, and then what Vatican II does is present the idea that not just the Roman Catholic Church and the Orthodox, and then outside of that circle is the Protestants, and outside of that circle is the heterodox Unitarians or something like this, and then outside of that circle is the Muslims, and then outside that circle is all the world religions, Hinduism, right? That's literally the view that it's presenting. And you can see that in the missionary document, because it goes on to talk about the secret presence of God present in all the world religions in paragraph 10. Now, you could talk about the Logos Spermatikos doctrine, but that's not what they're talking about. They're talking about all of the world religions. They call them the great world religions, right? And instead of calling out these world religions as being demonic, as being things that entrap people and confuse them, which is what 2 Corinthians 4:3 says, there's now a positive appraisal of all the world religions, right? In fact, it even goes on to say in the missionary activity document, Catholics and Protestants profess the same faith. Really? Then how 100 years prior to this does Vatican I excommunicate anyone who doesn't accept Vatican I? It's just ludicrous. It's not one faith, right? So, but what is the one faith that they're talking about here? Well, it means ultimately submission to Rome. And that's why they have to go on to say at the end of the missionary activity document that we have submitted the previous views of the church to a new examination in the light of the tradition of the universal church. So Vatican I is very clear. This is at the very end of the missionary activity. It's chapter 3. It's admitting the modernism view here, right? We're re-examining our tradition. Oh, it turns out non-Christians have many correct things about God. And rather than trying to convert, the missionary activity document in chapter 5 goes on to say Catholics should work with Protestants in missionary projects. And in fact, a conversion to Protestantism, right, is not a true conversion. I mean, that's what they should say. I mean, does anybody remember Martin Luther, the bull of excommunication against Luther, the countless propositions and heresies of Protestantism condemned in the hundreds of pages of Denzinger? And yet now the Catholics and Protestants should work together in missionary work in chapter 5? How can you do that if you don't have the same faith? It literally doesn't make any sense. Missionaries should adopt pagan religious traditions, the document goes on to say. Now, the only reason I'm saying all this is that this is where and how we get to Pachamama. It's not just Nostra Aetate. It's not just Unitatis Redintegratio. It's all the documents. It's Gaudium et Spes, right? About global government. It's the document about missionary activity, right?